Black History Month, not talking about the things that we know, George Washington Carver, beautiful history, powerful experiences. But we want to dive into stuff that may agitate you and the fact that we have been taught ill appropriately that Africans became kidnapped, tortured, and were now tagged as non-humans. And but they were Africans first, right? My man Xavier had a powerful quote. He said, "Slavery did not define African history; it interrupted it."
Rich.
That's why you get the big buck. But Xavier was bringing that out in light of the level of ownership in the African culture of who they are and the direction that they're trying to move into. And so many times, like the church has seen Africa as, we got to bring God to Africa. From African American churches to white churches, we got to bring God. God ain't there yet until we come and bring our drum lessons to Africa, right? I mean, I may be going, some extreme and craziness, but what would you say has been your experience as, sankofaus.com? I'm gonna keep saying that because y'all need to go right now while I'm talking and check it out and see the trips they got going on. And if they don't got one on the dates, you go and call them and see if they can work something out. But the reality is that the body of Christ, those who claim to be followers of Christ, I don't know, to me, may have the weakest movement as it pertains to sparking a real redemption of American history by bridging that. What would you say or what is your experience when it comes to the African American church, African American believers, followers of Christ, and their pushback or their welcoming of engaging in Ghana and Africa?
I will tell you, it is a subject that is near and dear to my heart, not because I like that reality, but because I think that that's what really needs to be exposed. So I really appreciate you, Pastor Phil, for even bringing that out in that way. That we have to keep in mind that the majority of folks who were spreading the gospel around the globe to Black nations, African nations in the 1930s or 40s were African American people. They weren't white. They were not European. They were Black. So because of the word against African American missionaries at the hands of white evangelicals in the United States who had their own missionaries in Africa, were already promulgating a narrative about Black folks in America to Africans. And so what happened is, and you can do your homework on this one, what happened is that when white evangelicalism in America was able to then influence policy, as has happened in many other eras of our time. And the policy then made it so that it was impossible for African Americans to get approval to travel to African countries by our own country, right?
Oh, wow. Like, wait, stop. Are y'all hearing that? Like, that's like when we do open mics, we always say, rewind if the bars were so cold. That was significant. I'm going to hopefully do it some justice. African Americans, in you said 30s and 40s in Africa, sharing the gospel, loving on folks who, again, God is already in Africa. It's not that we're just coming alongside where God is already working at in those spaces. You're saying then that they came back, African Americans who were doing missional work, building churches, building with believers there, coming back, telling white folks what was going on. White folks then made it harder for African Americans.
No, actually,
right with that?
It is white missionaries in Africa that did not like, and still to this day, don't like the presence of African Americans being in West Africa.
Oh my!
I'm not saying, I'm not pouring salt on white brothers and sisters just because I don't like the fact that they're there. It's important for us to understand the narrative and the negative narrative of African Americans, that has been perpetuated to Africans, came from white missionaries. It didn't come from other African Americans, right? And then much of what we learned about West Africa came from white missionaries who were here or white institutions were here. So there was a divide. There's this divide that goes way beyond 40, 50 years. This is a divide that has been there for some time. So we collectively have to say that we've been both miseducated. And the only way that we can be properly educated is to intentionally educate ourselves about that future, about that past that had been presented as being truth when in fact it was a lie.